Hey folks, welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter, and today we are going to talk about this book, Love After the End, an anthology of TwoSpirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction, edited by Joshua Whitehead. Why are we looking at this on a Lafferty channel? Well, I have talked a lot about how Lafferty is influenced by his Native American neighbors in Oklahoma in the first half of the century in the 60s, and wrote a lot of Native American characters, wrote an entire historical novel of the Choctaw people and these sorts of things. Native American studies is something that is an area of my research, and I try to understand that and be conversant in that discourse. And it seems to me that Lafferty at least gets a lot of things right, or heading towards getting things right with representing Native Americans and the Native American perspective. And as I've mentioned many times, and including just the previous video where we finished out with Snuffles in part 3 of that discussion, that I think he feels a deep simpatico, a deep sympathy between his Irish and Catholic sort of background and Native American views of the world, both being pre-colonial and post-colonial people who've been colonized by colonizers and who just look at the world in a not necessarily Enlightenment Western sort of way. Even though what's so strange about that is that there's obviously this incredibly fraught history between Catholicism and Native Americans, so it's kind of strange. On the other hand, there have been and are many Native Americans who are Christians of various varieties, including Catholics, and that's a debate for Native people to have amongst themselves. I have no say in that, but it's of interest. There's resonances and connections and things to be interrogated here. So any Native American literature to me is relevant to understanding Lafferty, and I've found that to be very fruitful in looking at various Native American authors such as N. Scott Momaday, Housemaid of Dawn, really even more so for me at the moment, the Way to Rainy Mountain by Momaday, and that's the one I looked at the most in my PhD thesis, and Leslie Marmon Silko, which I haven't written about in relation to Lafferty yet, but there's great connections in here, and things like that. But also the traditional storytelling, especially as I've mentioned many times, Christopher Tootin and the Cherokee storytelling tradition and the sort of worldview that arises from that and things like that have been so helpful, and just interesting resonances with what Lafferty is doing, but including very recent fiction by, say, Stephen Graham Jones. Also, I'm just continue to see these kinds of things. I recently finished a chapter that will be in a book on like zombies of the future on Stephen Graham Jones's zombie novels. Let's see, my working title is Towards a Blackfeet Biosemiotics of Post-Apocalypse, Tracking Eco-Monstrous Transmotion in the Zombie Fiction of Stephen Graham Jones. That's how academic titles go. Well, mine do anyway, because I like to say a lot in my title. Anyway, here's one of his zombie novels. Zombie Bake Off. What a blast. And yeah, I just continue to see this resonance and so on in Lafferty. And it's just general good research. But so to me, anything that has to do with Native American literature and storytelling and so on is a really fertile thing to look at in relation to Lafferty, along with so many other things we could look at, and we will look at all kinds of other stuff, but this is one of the key elements. So this book is really good for that, and this relates to my recent work in looking at Native American views of post-apocalypse, because that's mainly what these speculative stories are about. Now, there's a handful of things I want to say to begin with. One is that Stephen Graham Jones himself has this incredible essay called Letter to a Just Starting Out Indian Writer, and maybe to myself. And he says all kinds of cool stuff in there, but he really sets up a challenge. If you want to write about him and or about American Indian fiction at all, he's like really lays down a gauntlet. It makes it difficult because basically he says, look, people come looking at you as an American Indian or Native American author, and he says they're coming at you with like a a pin, like to pin you down like a butterfly on a board. And he's like saying to Native American writers, roll away from that, keep on the run, don't let them pin you down, you know. And part of his complaint about that I think is very warranted is that he says that, look, if people are coming at you primarily with this Native American identity as an author, they're not starting where they should start, and that is, this is fiction, this is art. Is it good? He's like, they should be asking, is this good fiction? Not, oh, let's look at it now as Native American stuff so we can have this anthropological, cultural discussion of what these people are doing, whether it's any good or not. And so I try to respect that when I look at Jones and others and say, is this good fiction? Am I looking at this as fiction first and foremost? And then, as you do with any fiction, you're looking at what it's doing, where it's coming from, what it's, you know, operating with and toward and all that kind of thing. And in the case of these authors, as Jones says, I'm an author who happens to be American Indian or Native American or Blackfeet in his case. And so, yeah, I want to try to honor that as best I can. And, you know, in this anthology, of course, it's an anthology of, as they say, TwoSpirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction, so it wants to be seen in that way, or wants to see itself in that way and have that own conversation amongst these communities. So, you know, that's kind of on the table to a certain extent. But I still want to say, part of how I'm going to show respect towards this is I'm going to talk about whether I think this is good or not. Okay, that's my respect toward you guys doing this work. All right, is I'm not just going to like go like, well, but it's cool because it's Native American. I'm going to be like, does it work? You know, did they do a good job? I mean, spoiler, I think this is admirable work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. One of my favorite things about this book, I have to say, is the introduction by the editor, Joshua Whitehead. It's a great piece of writing. It reminds me of Jones and some other people who write about Jones who are Native American. And man, if you haven't read any Native American literature, do yourself a favor. This stuff is wonderful. In ways that you won't expect, okay? I think, you know, we probably come to indigenous fiction from anywhere in the world with certain kinds of expectations. We're wanting it to be, you know, tribal or what have you. And man, I just got to tell you, this is the way Native Americans write genuinely reprograms my brain slowly but surely, my stubborn, obstinate Euro-settler brain. It is so light on its feet and innovative and provisional, yet with lots of verve and salt, you know. It's just great stuff. But here's one of the things, importantly, just to set up the conceptual parameters of a collection like this, that Joshua Whitehead says, I have asked myself, who names an event apocalyptic and whom must an apocalypse affect in order for it to be thought of as canon? How do we pluralize apocalypse? Apocalypses as ellipses? Who is omitted from such a saving of space? Whose material is relegated to the immaterial? Here too, I craft a theory of indigiqueerness by rejecting queer and LGBT as signposts of my identity, instead relying on the sovereignty of traditional language such as TwoSpirit and terminology we craft for ourselves, indigiqueer. How does queer indigeneity upset or upend queerness? So, you know, that's the kind of perspective here. This is not, you know, this is like Native Americans defining themselves, including in their sexuality. And sometimes they will adopt, you know, sort of that language of LGBTQ+, and other times they will quite specifically frame it in Native American terms. But that idea of like this sort of erasure that can happen in how we even define apocalypse and post-apocalypse is really important, and that's something I saw. There's a number of contemporary thinkers writing about Native American concepts of post-apocalypse, in that Native Americans are living in the post-apocalypse because they've lived through several apocalypses already. And, you know, interesting things about that connects to ontology and metaphysics and the way they view time and their relationship to ancestors and descendants that is very important. And in that erasure, I want to say, so I'm gonna pick a little bit of a fight here with a fellow YouTuber, okay? A friendly fight, I hope. And it's just the beginning of a conversation. You know, they probably won't respond to me and they don't need to, but just on my end. But there's a YouTuber a popular science fiction YouTuber called The Outlaw Bookseller, who has been putting out these videos on just what is SF, and that's great. And I've only watched the first one, and it's where he talks about it being defined by conceptual breakthrough, which I think is cool, you know, and it's pretty cool stuff he says about that, and you know, examples of that and that kind of thing. But just watch the first, I'll link to it here, just watch the first 5 minutes of it, and I think you'll see what I'm talking about. It seems to me that he enshrines a completely Western colonialist, by implication colonialist, but overtly Western, rationalist Enlightenment worldview as the way of progress, scientifically, rationally, in terms of rights, he says, and justice and these sorts of things, you know, that's what moves us forward, and that's what really science fiction is all about, you know. And as I've said in these videos we've looked at on Snuffles, I mean, Lafferty just problematizes that to the core, and that's a huge part of his project. And I have to say, it surprises me to hear people still saying this Enlightenment kind of thing in these times when so much critique has been done of that for so long, and it's really part of our culture now. But that said, it also speaks to my, you know, missing elements in my thought and research, and there's contemporary people still arguing for Enlightenment type of views that I need to read, and I want to do that. I have some ideas for who I might look at with that. So it's an ongoing opportunity on my part as much as anyone else's, but I think it's worth mentioning, and I think that this kind of work also speaks to that, because you know, he basically like overtly contrasts like rationality, Enlightenment rationality, and scientific progress and paradigm shifts with magic, and you know, by implication magical thinking and these sorts of things, which that's complicated. What is magic and magical thinking? But you know, that's certainly some indigenous views and older pagan views, which are still being held today and so on, can, you know, be shoved in that category. And he kind of says, you know, science fiction has nothing to do with that, I guess. You know, he seems to imply, if not outright state. And that leaves no room for this kind of stuff. And it's, you know, it's not surprising, at least in the video that I watched, that I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, there's no examples of his idea of conceptual breakthrough from like Afrofuturism or indigenous futurism and that kind of thing, you know. So it's a conversation worth having, and I think, you know, Lafferty's work and stuff like this is instigating something there just by existing. It doesn't even have to instigate, you know, it just is what it is, and you know, it's part of the conversation and not just erased by fiat. So anyway, to that point, listen to this thing that Joshua Whitehead also says in his introduction. And there's a lot of Native American words used from various languages, in this case Cree, throughout the stories. Let me say a word about that. It's beautiful, it's fun. These are incredible, lovely, interesting languages. You know, it's easy to, like, if you see a word or two of that, you kind of skim over it. It's what I do if I see like a French word or something, you know, oftentimes. But I got used to trying to linger over them a little bit and take some tiny stab at pronouncing. Sometimes in various works, you'll be given aids toward, you know, how to pronounce, and you get that in like Christopher Tooton's work. And you know, I took some time when I was reading through that to sort of try to follow the key of pronunciation and say some of those words. And I tell you, man, if you do that, you're in for a treat, because there's a rhythm and a breathing and a cadence and what have you to these words, because they tend to be long words with a lot of syllables and unfamiliar to us, seemingly unfamiliar vowel sounds and things. So in the case of the words in here, I'm afraid I have not looked them up and tried to figure out how to pronounce them. So please forgive me. But when I read these words, I'm going to go a little slower to you know, at least try to not just mangle them. But Whitehead says, "Who defines queerness, and under whose banner does it fly? Whose lands is it pocked within? I churn these words over in my mouth, taste that queered Cree on my tongue, and wonder if they are enough. Like wani ita misayawin, the Nihiya word for queer, as in strange, but it is also defined as uncanny, unsettling, or wani ita mohi wiwin, the act of deranging, perplexing. I find Indigiqueerness a hinterland. So, I mean, surely you see the connections to Lafferty there with the strange and the uncanny and the deranging and the perplexing. And, you know, that's fascinating. I mean, there's a sense in which, and people, you know, sometimes in queer theory, people do talk about a more general queerness of which queer sexuality is a part, that does this sort of this stranging or weirding of things. And I think that Lafferty, in that broad sense, if I may say, is kind of a queer writer. But yeah, so that's worth thinking about, and that's a part of what this kind of fiction is doing, and I think what it can bring to science fiction that can problematize and diversify this monolithic idea of the Enlightenment, rationality, and so on. So check out some other things he says here. For surely, like the histories of virologies written in our codex, from smallpox to HIV/AIDS to H1N1 and now COVID-19, the histories of our queerness, transness, non-binariness are back to originality, and our vertebrae are blooming heartberries and dripping seedlings. What does it mean to be two-spirit during an apocalypse? And on he goes and he doesn't like explain, you know, unpack those wonderful images and what they have to do with what he's talking about. It's just great. He says a few other things. At one point he says, how do we procure affinity in a sleeping bag outside of City Hall when the very ground is shaking beneath us with military tanks and thunderous gallops? What does it mean to be distanced under the weight of colonial occupation and relocation? It's a story we know all too well. We find one another in the cybersphere, hyper-res sphere, in the arenas of dreamscapes and love grounds. We emerge in pixel and airwave, and we have never lost the magic of our glamour within such a vanishing act. We've always controlled the I of our narrativized I. I suppose I note these ruminations in order to announce TwoSpirit and Indigiqueers are the wildest kinds of biopunks, literally and literarily. What a cool statement. And, you know, res is a short for the reservation, if you're not aware of that. But this emphasis on dreamscapes and cyberspace and, you know, sort of this persistence of existence within attempted erasure. And this is what an awesome Native American writer called Gerald Visner talks about in various works. I'm still trying to come to terms with him. I haven't finished this book. It's really quite difficult in a lot of ways, but this, I mean, talk about something akin to Lafferty. My goodness, this is wild stuff. I love it. It's amazing. But he's also a theorist, and he's very famous for this idea of survivance, which he also connects to transmotion, which is the part of his theory that I'm looking at in my article on Stephen Graham Jones, who is influenced by Visner. So, you know, survivance has to do with that persistence of existence within, you know, colonial erasure and purgation and these sorts of things. And that is what Whitehead, I think, is speaking to in a particularly now and future way that speaks to science fiction and speculative fiction. And so to that point, a lot of what the stories in this book are about have more to do with representation, you know, sheer presence. Presence is so important. And TwoSpirit and otherwise LGBTQ plus, so to speak, characters are just sort of part of the stories here, and then it's a, you know, a post-apocalyptic setting or whatever, and that can kind of be the extent of it, whereas others get into a little bit more of the cultural relevance of a two-spirit person. But the point is they exist in the future, which is a radical enough statement in itself, and you know, in some ways tragically that should be a radical statement. Now, as to Lafferty and queerness, you know, I'm not going to try to sugarcoat that. I would have to say that it seems that there's tiny little indications within Lafferty's writing that he probably was a product of his particular time and the cultural quadrant that he was in of a more conservative traditional Catholicism, to where I, you know, don't think he would have approved, you know, like anything needs approval, but you know what I mean, you know, would have affirmed LGBTQ plus identity. And that saddens me to say that my favorite writer would be blighted by that. That's just a reality. That is a reality that you have to deal with a lot of writers from former times in a lot of regards. You know, people like Lovecraft is famously racist. Are you going to stop reading him? Are you going to stop looking for what we might salvage from that? That's fine if you want to do that. Absolutely. Go for that. That's valid move. But I think it's also valid to continue to look at that, to interrogate and critique and, dismantle the problematics of older writers whilst seeing what they might still contribute. And in the case of Lafferty, I think it's fascinating that I think he actually has the seeds in his writing of affirming a broader idea of gender and sexuality, because he just cannot stop challenging the construction of gender, of constantly critiquing hypermasculinity in hilarious ways, not least related to like militaristic SF and these sorts of things, and portraying women in wonderfully exciting ways. One of the most striking things is women have such incredible physical strength in Lafferty's stories, and they carry men about on their shoulders and whatnot. It's just fascinating and wonderful, and they're very vibrant and intelligent and are in the professions alongside the men very frequently in these sorts of things. Not that there's not problems there too, where sometimes there's just like this one primordial female character in the midst of all these male characters in certain novels and stories. That happens too, so there's things to interrogate there as well. But I still just think it's fascinating. He even, I think, gets into masculinity being within women and femininity being within men and these sorts of things. So I think there's interesting things to look at there with Lafferty, and meshing that with his inclusion of Native Americans and stuff. A work like this can help further that discussion. So to get into the stories, first we have Abacus by Nathan Adler. This was cool. It's about basically a rat. There are rats in the future on a moon off of Jupiter, and this has all been bioengineered by humans, that serve as living sort of AI. And the story doesn't get into a lot of details about that. Really cool idea though. It's kind of a queer coming of age story. The rat becomes the boyfriend or crush, I guess, burgeoning boyfriend of this coming of age Native American boy in cyberspace and partly in real life. It's pretty cool. I think it starts out a little stronger than it finishes, and I have to say that's a bit of a theme in this anthology, that sometimes the setup is better than where they're able to take it. And it does tend to be what I would call the genre of lit fic, and I do think this kind of fits into that, but also doesn't in certain respects, but which can be speculative fic and so on. It just, to me, so clearly comes out of creative writing courses and these sorts of things, and is really aiming at a very certain kind of fiction mode that I've heard people say could be called a Joycean epiphany fiction. And I have to admit, that is not my favorite kind of fiction. That said, some of my all-time favorite authors, I think, come out of that. So an older author would be like Flannery O'Connor, I think directly comes out of that tradition, but then sort of exceeds it. I would say that Stephen Graham Jones strikes me as coming out of that kind of tradition, but massively exceeds it. In this case, I'm so invested in Native American literature and issues and identity and so on that I was touched by these stories, really. And that made it worth it alone to me. But one thing I will say about this Abacus story about the AI rat is that showing how these new entities, these AI rats, are the new, like, oh, they're not real people. They don't have to be treated with full rights and so on. And then it became in that way, and I didn't think it was terribly ham-fisted, it was gentle, and it kind of dawned on me like an allegory of sorts for Indigiqueer existence and so on. And I was really moved by that. I found that pretty profound. And another thing about this story that is a feature of pretty much all the stories, when sort of sun and moon and planets and stuff are named in this story, they're considered kin. They're called grandfather and grandmother and things like that. And mother, of course, for Earth, where these people originally came from, and that kind of thing. And first of all, for me, it's just cool, man. I want to see more of that in science fiction, those kinds of indigenous views represented in just the sheer given language of scientific or astronomical realities. But it speaks to what could be dismissed as, magical thinking or something, to consider ourselves in kinship with things that by certain standards don't have rationality, that don't have brains or personality or anima or souls or whatever, either because we reconfigure what in the world soul or agency or whatever can mean, or have a spiritual view of these things, or whatever reasons. It's not laid out. It's not like some kind of manual to how to understand. It's just a given that resonates. And I think, that's a good example of what I'm talking about, that can be erased if we just go, oh, conceptual breakthrough is all about the next, Enlightenment advance in the sciences. This can be a conceptual breakthrough. And lastly, in regard to this story, some of the science fictional writing, there's some really good stylizing going on, and there usually is in most of these stories, in parts at least, is well done and has that sort of intimate, immersive quality that for me is how SF works the best when it's trying to show you this unfamiliar world. And there's different ways to do that, and I talked about that in the last video, how Lafferty and Wolf have similar but different views where they get your imagination, or different approaches where they get your imagination to do the heavy lifting through their either illusion or more concrete but still compact ways of describing things and leaving things undescribed. And you get a bit of that with this story, but many of the stories fall down in this aspect. Somewhere in there, they tend to break the spell a little bit by maybe over description or over explanation. And that's just a tightrope that anybody trying to write science fiction has to walk, and that everybody fails at, from the greatest to the least, so to speak. The second story is History of the New World by Adam Garnett Jones. This one has a really cool premise that unfortunately I don't actually think is fully achieved in execution. The story itself and a lot of things it's doing is great, but this particular speculative element in the fullness of its execution in the story is not completely satisfying to me. But basically, in a post-apocalyptic situation where people need to leave the Earth, instead of needing to leave the planet for another planet, which some of the stories do, there's been a gate opened to a parallel world and a parallel Earth. Now, that's just such a cool idea, and I know other people have done that, but I don't know that I've heard of that as like a way to get out of apocalypse or post-apocalypse. Tell me if you know of stories like that. But beyond sort of stating that premise, it's not developed either, it doesn't have to be at length, it just has to have some kind of concrete development to it, either in an indirect way that just gives you the feel, the sense of wonder of this strange discovery or what have you, or in any kind of technical sort of explanation of it. Neither of those are given, and it makes it feel a little bit flat, a little bit less than it could be. But as I said, it's not about that. It's about how people are living, and that's how these stories are a little more lit fic. It's a lot of family relationships and stuff like that, which is cool. And I think that can happen in more intentionally and thickly sort of genre SF too. Can be done well, but I think that's more the emphasis here. But again, speaking to this sort of representation of non-enlightenment views in science fiction, there's this part where thinking of this planet as a twin, planet to Earth. The narrator says, "Twins share a womb, I thought. They grow from the same mother. I waited for the politicians and scientists to concede the existence of a grandmother of universes, but no such announcement came." And again, that sort of sense of kinship and relationality of the universe and causality and these sorts of things is interesting. And it's very indirectly implied then that the central problem of this story is due to a lack of that kind of view. And that's what I find troubling about this idea that science fiction is all about an enlightenment, scientific, rational breakthrough that leads to more rights and justice and stuff in the world, which it just historically has not and has tended to oppress peoples and stuff in its execution in certain respects. And in this case, you see it, you're kind of like, because basically there's this lush Earth-like planet that is going to be a great place to colonize, and they just can't find any intelligent life on it. You can see what's coming there. But eventually they discover there's an underwater species of sort of manatee-like creatures that are the intelligent people of that world. And this is a cool relational aspect here, that interpersonal aspect, that this is a couple. The indigenous person in that relationship is TwoSpirit, and they have a child together through a donor, but it's the indigenous person's egg, so the child is genetically indigenous. I think this character is Anishinaabe, and once she discovers that this planet is occupied by an intelligent species, obviously it's a huge crisis for her. She's like, what? This happened to my people, and now I'm going to be part of that, like a colonialist enterprise that just comes and takes over somebody else's land. So it's a crisis for her. I like the way it describes their relationship. When first we met, Thora was a blue-eyed liberal atheist who had descended from honest-to-God, real United Empire loyalists. I was bold enough to laugh when she told me about her lineage, and she was fresh enough to have no idea why. I was a brown-eyed TwoSpirit, Nihayao, with a homemade haircut and marrow-deep longing for the old things that rumbled under the surface of the world. And just that meeting of worlds, but yet they have a love relationship. However, those tensions do come to a breaking point, sadly. That relationship of these people is almost like the relationship between that, in some ways, mainstream strand of SF that says it's about this Enlightenment scientific breakthrough, and these people where it's like they don't even understand the differences between themselves sometimes. But here they are together in this enterprise, this artistic enterprise of SF. When, she discovers that this place is occupied, she says, I put my hand out for the velvet shoulder of a chair. It's not empty, I said. The planet was never empty. And man, that's a big one. That's the idea of an empty land, man, that's a big one in all kinds of, post-colonial writing and ecological writing and Western, for example, in one of my areas, Western US writing. And for Lafferty, that's a big deal. He's constantly showing a US Western landscape that is alleged by someone to be empty in some sense, and which is not, and which is peopled, not only by humans, but by more than humans. I mean, look at Sodom and Gomorrah, Texas. Look at Boomer Flats. Look at the most vivid one, Smo in the Implicit Clay. It's all about that idea. So there's a good connection there with Lafferty. And so they end up splitting. The white woman goes on to this parallel world through a gate, and this woman and the daughter don't. And it's tragic, and it does this thing. This idea that for various reasons, indigenous peoples and others may not be able to be part of the escape plan. And they're left here with Mother Earth and have to try to rebuild that relationship if possible. And that's the case here. And there's a camp of Anishinaabe, queer affirming camp, that this mother and daughter go to in the end. And so it ends, and it's partly through somebody even further in the future that got this from their Nokom. Nokomis and other terms for grandmother and grandfather are used a lot in this book. And in that first story with the rat and everything, grandmothers and grandfathers as storytellers and keepers of tradition stuff are very important in this, even in the midst of like virtual reality stuff going on and all kinds of things. And it's really cool to see that brought forward into the future. And they mentioned that there were eventually reports that whole new colonization thing did not work out well, and that the gate was closed, so they couldn't bring back their problems with it. And that the daughter, she lived in that time, in the time before the plants and animals took back the city with their muscular roots and hungry young. It was before the high law was signed by our matriarchs, shared responsibilities between the people and all our relations, the ones that walk on four legs, the ones that swim, the ones that soar in the air, the ones with leaves and branches, our grandfathers the mountains and our grandmothers the waters. Of course, the cycles of war and peace, love and heartbreak, hunger and feasting roll on, but with the understanding that we must always strive for balance. Above all, our circle must be round. Such a great ending, and I forgot to mention that as one of the cool, this is a really good SF moment where you get that mystery of the alien, where they get some communications from these underwater peoples, but they don't know exactly how to translate it, so they try several things. And various translators on Earth come up with, your circle is not round. All beings require more than one tide. Even desert animals live underwater. And that's left quite mysterious, like what could that mean? So it's a really good pondering point. But she fixates on this, your circle is not round, and that's a very important idea in some Native American thinking about the circle. God, sucks that things like Circle of Life have been Disneyfied and cliched, but yes, the circle of beings, of existence, the hoop of existence it's sometimes called, and how important that is for it to connect and stuff. So that's how this story ends. Next is The Arc of the Turtle's Back by J. Simpson. Now, if you don't know, Turtle Island is the name of the USA and or North America for a lot of indigenous peoples there. Now, this one almost seemed more dystopian than post-apocalyptic to me, and the speculative element of that was vague in the extreme. And I guess I'm a little undecided if I thought that really worked. Like, oh, it's just like an assumption there in the background, or if it's like a little unsatisfying. And in this case, this is Ojibwe people, which are actually part of the Anishin and Abi people. And there's a lot of creative pronoun use in this, obviously they, them, but other types of pronouns as well. I have to say one thing I was a little disappointed about in this collection is there wasn't a lot of emphasis or evocation of place in this, whether it be speculative and or off-world or otherwise. But there are moments. And this one has a whole bunch of similes and maybe metaphors of the landscape and non-humans and things to describe things, and they're pretty good, pretty cool. I think water scarcity is one of the main issues in this scenario, and people are evacuating to Mars. But it comes to the attention of these characters that there's a push to get indigenous people to go to Mars, and other people deemed suitable for this, but basically to get them to be laborers, maybe forced laborers. And so these characters begin to resist this idea of escaping to Mars. And in the midst of this, one of the characters is needing transition surgery in terms of their transgender identity, and that's difficult to get in that time as well as our time. In this case, because of resources and things. And the characters are torn about leaving Mama Earth, Mother Earth. They're like, you know, it's like literally leaving a mother, literally leaving kin. And they're like, how can this be? You know, is this what we should even do? You know, and they have to wrestle with that. And there's a moment where that character who's needing the transition surgery is able to get it. And as they awake from it, they are upset, and not about the surgery, but about the realization of this sacrifice of having to leave Mother Earth. The narrator says, sobs ripple through my shoulders like earthquakes, buckling, achy, torn from her Nimama's breast, a dry wail billowing out of my throat like ribbon in prairie tornado. I am screaming not from the procedure, but the sacrifice. I am trying to let go of Nimama Aki, Mother Earth. And it's a poignancy that an Enlightenment rationalist view might not have to wrestle with. Maybe that's not fair. Maybe that view has its own way of thinking of this planet in kinship, and it would be a hard parting. But I still think this view is worth it folding into how we look at these speculative futures. And so the speculative element of this is pretty awe-inspiring, but again, I just didn't feel it achieved full execution. When I say these things don't fully achieve it, there's nothing like cringeworthy or like really poor about this stuff. You know, there's a certain level that they've achieved here that, as I say, is admirable. I just think, you know, that you sense that like, oh, this could have gone further, right? And so they basically create these gigantic space vessels called arcs. And this is another thing that doesn't achieve full execution, because there's a terrible existential conundrum here that is, I wasn't even sure I fully understood it, because it seems kind of brushed over, and it was an opportunity to really make this story just go interstellar, which is what this is about, because the moon has been colonized and Mars has been colonized, but there's oppression and so on. So they're like, we've figured out a way to just get out of the solar system. But to use these things, these massive things, they're going to destroy the Earth and quite possibly the Moon and Mars, or severely disable them through their takeoff of these various large ships. And I guess sort of the nuclear thing that happens there. But they decide to do it. And it's not really talked about. You know, it's implied what the effect of that is. And they do wrestle over it a little bit, but like it doesn't, you know, describe it or talk about it. It's pretty wild. So I would have liked to have seen more of that going on there, and more of the like sort of dread. And there is a commitment from the beginning of the book that said they were going to go in a dystopian direction, but decided to go in a utopian direction. And so it's kind of a solar punk type thing. And all the stories, no matter how dark they get, do end on some kind of positive, hopeful note. And I'm certainly not opposed to that at all. I just think, I am of the opinion that kind of stuff has to be earned. And that's why I love the writing of Cormac McCarthy and Lafferty, really. There's a lot of blood and guts and darkness and fire and stuff to get through to have a glimmer of hope. But yeah, there's a lot in here about sweat lodge ceremonies and smudge ceremonies, which are important with smoke and stuff in some nations. And they're doing one in the end in space on one of these arcs, which is really cool. And they talk about how are we going to build a relationship with this new planet that we are going to. And one character says, I would assume like all consensual relationships, we ask them out. Interesting, because you're already going to be there, so I'm not sure. But I like the idea that there is this sense of like, we are entering a new world, not to colonize, but to see if we can develop a consensual relationship. Pretty cool. Next is How to Survive the Apocalypse for Native Girls by Kai Minosh Pyle. This one has a really creative formal approach with these numbered points that are basically this guide, at least for a while it does that. And it kind of goes in and out of different sorts of narration and perspectives. And this one has, a core tragedy to it about even within indigenous communities, there's not always acceptance of queer or two-spirit people, and a central sort of trauma around that. And it starts out a little bit YA feeling to me, and there's a fair bit of that kind of stuff in this collection. And I know I just said that as if that's a problem. It's just not really my thing overall, though I've enjoyed some of what has been called YA. I mean, Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea, I think, is often considered YA, though I think when she wrote it, there was no such category. And I think it's brilliant and beautiful. So I don't have a problem with that. I just think it's hard to do it right. And especially a lot of what seems to come out these days is like that lit fic thing where it's a very particular type of YA that just is not especially of interest to me. And if I'm honest, seems to me to often not be well done. But okay, whatever. And so it kind of starts that way, but it gets a little more serious as it goes. And here's another moment that really speaks to this question of Enlightenment, rationality in science fiction and that kind of thing, where one of the points is different teachings are correct. Love that phrasing. Different teachings are correct. She elaborates a little bit. Everyone is taught in a different way. We can't say that one teaching is the only correct one, because then you would be putting down someone else's teaching. Now, this isn't just about like preserving feelings and being nice to people. It's about understanding that there are different domains of knowledge and understanding and frameworks that can have equal validity even when they are so different and perhaps in some ways seem competing or incommensurable. We need a certain suppleness and finesse in understanding the world to be able to bring together a variety of views. And I think that's important, and in SF. And there's a really interesting complication in one of the points, number 6. Here's an instruction: love is good. It goes on talking about that, and then it says, love is part of kinship laws. It is the kinship laws. Of course, in reality, kinship is just as much about hating each other and messing each other up as it is about loving each other. But without love, there wouldn't be any kinship at all. So there's a lot of that in here, I think. There's a lot of subtle thinking where, though this is a solar punk utopian sort of view, and it is always about kinship and a certain kind of spirituality and so on, and harmony and balance and these sorts of things, it's just like, man, this stuff is complicated and messy and ugly and sometimes tragic. So it's really cool in that way. It's very honest in that way. And I guess, I said I like, if there's going to be hope, it needs to be earned through darkness. And in the conceptual parameters laid out, that is certainly true in these stories. And I think it works, that the hope and or positive view that they try to show is earned at least at the framework level, and I suppose largely in the stories themselves. But some of the endings feel almost tacked on to make sure we hit that end on that hope note. That's the only problem I have. I just think it could be done a little more artfully sometimes. And there's some interesting stuff about Wendigo in here. She says, here's a teaching about Wendigoog for you. Wendigoog are more than just cannibals. They are possessed by a hunger that only increases every time they try to fill it. That hunger can be for anything: food, drugs, sex, love, but most of all, power. So getting into some indigenous monster theory here as well, which is cool. And some of this story also has to do with Black people not always being accepted into indigenous communities because they're not enough indigenous. And this can happen to other races or racial mixtures as well. This person is, part African American, part indigenous, and how certain hungers for power within the community are monstrously affecting this person and that kind of thing. But the sort of dystopian and or post-apocalyptic aspect to this story was really vague, and I can't decide if I think it's cool that it's just like way out there on the outskirts and an assumption, and here we are in the quotidian life of these people, or if it's a little bit unsatisfying. But it has to do with sort of how communities work and interact, and that would be an issue in a post-apocalyptic scenario. Next we have Anduana Nikajigan by Gabriel Castellu-Calderon. Now this one gets pretty weird, and that's very welcome. I kind of expected and hoped for more of that, given how that intro by Joshua Whitehead, talking about how indigenous terms for queer speak to the uncanny and the strange and stuff like that. And that wasn't always evident, although from this point in the collection that becomes a little more evident as it also becomes more overtly spiritual. But in this case, there's basically this sort of subset of storytellers, story keepers, who when they hear someone's story, it manifests on them as a red marking that is later likened to, essentially it seemed to me, the buttons that were on recording devices in past times. This is the future, and I guess that technology is no longer around. And basically, without explanation, it's pretty slipstream or magical realism or something like that, and fabulation maybe, in that there's no explanation for this, but it's pretty damn cool. And then they press them again to be able to just, now they have it by heart, whatever that story was. And it can be any kind of story. It's native stories, but it's also just stories that people tell, but also relations of like novels and stuff, like Western novels. It's just very cool, interesting. And it kind of goes in and out of these narratives of past and present, and it's pretty nicely done. But there's some opposition to these people in an attempt to wipe them out. And there's some bloodshed and violence and kidnapping involved. And at one point in this character's memories, you get a little bit of a look into the spirituality of the TwoSpirit. In this case, and in a lot of the stories, Iquiwak is the term for that. A grandmother is speaking to their grandchild. There was a time when Iquiwak were honored. Every village had Iquiwak. They were needed to be in the in-between for the spirits and the rest of us here in the physical world. Without the Iquiwak being the bridge, we would be in the dark about so much happening around us. We would be out of balance with the world. How do I talk to spirits? As Ikwu, Kokomis. The elder smiled, his dark, wrinkled face lighting up the presence of his small grandchild. You need to be very still and very silent, Oshis. Then send your intent. Kindly ask them for a message. Offer them a gift for their aid, and they will come. The old man picked up his grandchild and gently sat her on his knee. I am Ikwu, just like you, Oshis. In a few years, when you receive your first marks, you will come to me and learn how to carry your role for our village. Grandchild held grandmother, the smell of sage and sema, feeling of safety and kindred souls cloistered around the two. I can't wait, Kokomis. Now you'll notice the shift of pronouns there between he and her, and grandmother and grandfather, because this grandparent is TwoSpirit as well. But there you have it. I mean, like, just blatant spirituality in this case. And here it shifts. There's like a weirder magical sort of element in these welts rising or whatever on the people. That's, I think, a speculative fiction sort of element. But here I don't think this isn't like, the magical Indian. This is a genuine spirituality of these people and their understanding of the world. And again, that I don't think has much room in some of these ideas of Enlightenment scientific progress that allegedly leads to all this justice or whatever. And when this character enters this spiritual reality for a moment, this is how it describes it. She's accidentally started to bleed from ties that she has, from rubbing against ties from her kidnapping. A moment passed. The bleeding stopped. The earth heaved and sighed. It trembled slightly. Wisps rose around her. Shapes and smoke winded around her body, tickling her soul. Upside down and backward faces greeted her. Antlers and horns, hoof and claw all spoke to her. The rocks under her warmed. The dirt cooled. Her ancestors came, whispering soothing encouragement in ancient tongues, reminded her they were always there. And it's just, I was so impressed with this kind of stuff coming through in this like speculative fiction. And again, this is the kind of thing you see in Lafferty a lot, to be honest. Sometimes it comes through in Native American characters and kind of their perspectives and what they're doing, though he doesn't do a whole lot of that with Native American characters. He does not, sort of exoticize the Native American. They're quite down-to-earth contemporary characters most of the time, but they will occasionally have a spiritual thing. But this kind of spirituality actually is spread throughout his characters, native or not, in his stories. And in different ways, though, in sort of resonant ways, rather than like directly, oh, look, he's doing Native American spirituality. It's again, like I said, he senses this resonance and sympathy between them. So he has his own cultural resources for viewing agency in non-humans and kinship between humans and non-humans and that kind of thing. And I won't say that he just folds in the Native American to that. I don't think it's quite, it's not appropriation. It's just that he's like, oh, that's happening there as well. And I like that, and I would like to narrate that, and that kind of thing. And there's like a Native American vision of creator and creation and the two-legged and four-legged and so on in this spirituality here. Someone even seems to come back from death in this, which is again a Laffertian theme as well. So toward the end of the story, it basically explains that the reason this technology for recording, this basically recording technology, isn't around anymore is that it was destroyed by an oppressive government to kind of erase that past knowledge and have control over it. And that's why this kind of spiritual, supernatural response happened to where it was able to be recorded within people. Although there's a transference, those people, this character is like the last of those people, and there's a transference to memorizing again happening in here. But also it seems to indicate that there's going to continue to be these supernatural ways to do that. So it says, "We're not quite sure, but the spirits have told me that our way of sharing stories can't stay within our people anymore. It's time to share this way of learning with others. Just as we have adapted a supernatural way of learning, we are therefore meant to adapt a supernatural way of sharing." So I wasn't entirely sure what this meant in this story and what was going on exactly, but I am so here for it. So I like that. I think there's a lot in here that I am really struggling to see. Is this a little bit of a lapse in craftsmanship or artistry that has kind of left things underexplained or under-evoked? Or is this really good artistry that's like keeping it mysterious and causing us to engage? And I suspect it's somewhere in between there. But regardless, I am walking away from reading this going, whoa, I have so much to think about and feel. This is exciting. So I love this collection for that reason. Next is Story for a Bottle by Darcy Little Badger. Yeah, this is another pretty weird one that again, I'm so sorry to have to say this, and it may be my reading. I would love to hear, what other people think of this anthology and the stories in it. But I feel like it's this opportunity, this great interesting thing is brought up, and it's done capably, but it's like it could have gone further, could have been stranger and more resonant. But basically, this kid gets kidnapped by a living boat at a birthday party on the beach. That's pretty cool, man. Pretty cool. There's a bit of like weird fiction type resonance to this, but also a bit of like some of the odd approaches to science fiction that I particularly find in Gene Wolfe's short stories. This reminded me on certain levels very much of a Gene Wolfe short story. And just at the beginning, there's this really nice description of the beach and this kid on the beach. So that sense of place that I wish there was more of, but that's quickly replaced by being on this big metal, mechanical kind of submarine type thing that tricked the kid into thinking there was a little kid in there that needed help, and then climbed in and the kid kidnapped it, and then it's like using it to keep its maintenance up. And what you eventually find, it's very cool, speculative, post-apocalyptic speculative idea. Although in this case, I think the story implies that the apocalypse never happened, that things did work out, but these people had tried a certain way of surviving it by creating these kind of living metallic islands out in the ocean, these huge submarines or whatever, that were going to sustain them in an elitist sort of way. It was for the wealthy and this kind of thing. But the apocalypse never happened, and these things didn't work out, and all the people died on them and stuff. But the sort of AI aspect to it is continuing on and looking for a human to help run it. Although it turns out the AI is still partly powered by an actual human, some kind of symbiosis there between the machine and the human. The human is very old and grotesque at this point, but it's plugged in. Like this part where the young girl has the realization, I was trapped in an artifact with a cruel streak. What a great sentence. I was trapped in an artifact with a cruel streak. Man, just use that. Like, keep that one going. Apply it to so many different things. That is badass. And again, the queer element is simply, there's these characters are queer, and that's just, they're present, which is great. And it doesn't even end totally resolved. There's this assumption she's probably tricked the boat and worked her way back to finding her people again on that shore, but it's not totally certain. So it's one of the only ones that has that slightly darker note, although the tone doesn't really feel dark. I enjoyed this one. It was fun. Again, I think I just felt it didn't quite make the most of its scenario, but it was cool. Yeah, I like that. Next is Seed Children by Marie Curasato. And here it's kind of an Anishinaabe two-spirit cyborg, I think. And that there are, again, this is like the rat story at the beginning, where it becomes this implied allegory about what people have suffered through and are suffering through now, to be recognized as fully people, fully human, if you will, or just people. But here applied to as happens a lot in science fiction, robots basically, artificial people, and we're gonna have some interesting discussions about robots, AIs, artificial people and stuff in Lafferty, because it's complicated. If you read Past Master kind of lightly, you might get this idea that like, oh, he's against machines and robots and artificial intelligence and all that kind of thing. But he totally problematizes that then in Arrive at Easterwine, which is the autobiography of an AI that seems like this completely sympathetic character and totally a person. But also you can see elements of that in Past Master, but they're just kind of really in there. And, there is a thing about somehow there being these cyborg sort of children, and they are partly human and partly machine. And you get a bit of that in Past Master, and at least one sympathetic character that I think is on the side of sort of the rebels against the dystopia. So it's complicated in Lafferty. And there's this really bloody action scene where she has to activate kind of her, I guess, nanotechnology that will convert her into just like this awesome military killing machine. It's her only option. She really doesn't want to do it, but to get out of this mess and save some people. And there's like this explosive action scene for a moment. It felt very like a Hollywood action movie for just a second, but it was kind of fun. They're called synth persons and synth babies and stuff. And, so somebody who's against them comes to see them as more, as like actual people. And, this is one where that science fiction element, it's good, it's fun, but it did feel light. It did feel it could be a little thicker, a little more robust. But there's a part where she says, "We're alive, we hurt, we feel, and we pray, just like you." Very cool. And basically, just right at the end of the story, I mean, it's, two or three pages worth of description, but there's no build up to it as to what this is, this great tree that has these basically like interstellar seed pods that are like, it says like the size of a mansion. So her and some of the synth people get in this thing to escape, and the tree like somehow shoves this seed way up into orbit and launches it. And it's a very cool idea, and I love it. And there's probably been other stuff like that done in SF that I'm just not aware of. I would assume. I just feel like something like that has surely been done. And this isn't particularly, I felt, tied to anything indigenous this particular technology, and I kind of wanted it to be a little more, given, you know, the theme of this anthology. But it was cool. It just, you know, it was, again, I felt it was a bit slight, but it was enjoyable. And we have Nameless by Nazba Tong. This was one of my favorites, despite, I would still say, sharing some of these, for lack of a better word, weaknesses. But, you know, these opportunity areas that some of the other stories have, I felt like more could have been made of the scenario. But the writing is very competent, sometimes better than competent. But I think the spirituality aspect grabbed me maybe the most out of all those kinds of things in this story. And it kind of flits back and forth between these two sort of settings of the past and the future, and a person spiritually contacting this person in the past through that means. And the person in the future who's doing this is TwoSpirit. And they're basically achieving this through a sort of dream travel. But there's just like one moment where it's just kind of, as an aside, asked, where are dreams? I love that question. What a cool ontological question. Where are dreams? And I suppose there's a all too easy sort of neuroscientific answer to that question, but I think it could be more interesting than that. I mean, that's interesting, what's happening in the brain and synapses and stuff. That's awesome. Love that stuff, but, you know, also more. And this person from the future basically ultimately has this message for this person in their past: come home, there's no more time for being lost, it's time to be found, about reconnecting to their indigenous roots and different things like that. And it just speaks to a profound sense of how time works in Native American worldviews that, again, I was looking at in terms of post-apocalypse and stuff, and just the sense of how we live toward ancestors and descendants, and how there is a loop of time and causality there that is fascinating. And there's different ways, there's different disciplines to bring to bear on ideas like that. There's philosophy of time, and there's religious sort of types of views or spiritualities and things. But even in terms of something like, even like an analytic philosophy of time, there's some real meat in these Native American ideas. And they're taken up by a non-Native American writer that I've mentioned a lot on this channel, Donna Haraway, especially in this book, Staying with the Trouble, making kin in the Cthulhu scene, not the Cthulhu scene of Lovecraft, but the Cthulhu scene, which is the Chthonic ones who live in Kainos time, which is this kind of time that has to do with descendants and ancestors and is loopy and so on, which also speaks to, I've been talking a lot about Timothy Morton and his dark ecology and his sense of looping time. But yeah, and there's not applications like it's just some kind of use value thing, but there is import from these views of time to how we understand things like the Anthropocene in our ecological situation. So I love that kind of stuff. And this story was a pretty good evocation of that reality for Native Americans. We have Eloise by David A. Robertson to round out the collection. And I had a little trouble with this one. I thought it was competent writing like usual, and a pretty interesting story, and some moments of some really good stylized writing about sun motes dancing in the air, which is better than that. That sounds terrible. It's really good, and about skin being braille and stuff. It's really nice writing in some parts of this, and again, smudge ceremonies, but to do with this, I guess, VR type of technology that I just didn't feel was especially, you know, the evocations are okay, but it felt a very near future Black Mirror type scenario, which is fine and can be done well, but even in Black Mirror and stuff is not always done all that well. But more importantly than that, it was just that this strange sort of teenage relationship that had to do with meeting somebody and then never seeing them and then never calling and then wanting to forget them felt like, maybe I really missed something here, but it felt like unsupportably melodramatic. You know, it was just like, wait, he's so like this really angsty teenage crisis that was supposed to come into this big sort of technological cultural thing. There's a way that could be done that would be like, yeah, that's realistic, that's the world we're living in, but it didn't quite feel like that to me. But again, you know, that could be me. I may have misunderstood something here. I may have been a little impatient with it. I'm not sure. But it was an entertaining little story. And, you know, it was two girls who were in love with each other. And again, it ends on that positive note. So all in all, a good collection. Is well worth your time just to expand your sense of who SF includes and what kinds of worldviews and philosophies it can include. And I want more indigenous science fiction. Please give me your recommendations if you know of good stuff. So thank you for watching, and we'll be going back to Lafferty soon.